just laying the ground, right, providing the backdrop for us to understand Trump 2.0 going forward. So let's maybe come back to the China-U.S. relations. So far, Trump does not seem to have displayed the same kind of tough attitude toward China as he did during his first term. At times, he even suggests that the China and the United States and China could, work together to solve most of the world's problem. And in your view, so was it a casual remarks by him, or does it reflect his sort of more general stance? And also, he threatened to impose tariff on China and many other countries. There's already several rounds of initial tariffs out there, and probably there will be again, I think, on April 2nd, another rounds to be announced. But at the same time, he also sent his quote unquote special envoy, Senator Abrams, to visit China for this China Development Forum. And of course, Chinese leaders, Premier Li Qiang received him, and Vice Premier He Lifeng as well. So what do you think is the likelihood of, so Trump's talking about shocking deal, and apparently, he won the deal, but at the same time was trying to use all these kind of, tough talk about or threat of imposing tariffs on China. So do you think how likely is there's going to be a so-called deal? Or there might be risk of the escalation really into a new round of trade war between China and the United States.
Yeah. Well, if you go back, his number one objective, I believe, with the tariffs, there's two objectives. One is he's really not educated in basic economics. So he's focused very much on trade balance. Everyone who really understands trade would say trade imbalances are simply a reflection of market sources. So if China is able to produce higher quality goods at lower costs, you as the buyer ought to be happy because you're going to improve the standard of living in your country, the US, and do it in an economic way. So he's starting out with the idea that trade imbalances are bad and therefore tariffs will help us correct that problem. But his real underlying issue is the US has gone from being the dominant manufacturer globally to not only trailing China, but being distanced by China in a very substantial way. So his view is that if I put in a strong enough tariffs, I'm going to be able to take back from China a lot of the manufacturing that we have lost over the years. Well, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because China has some very substantial competitive advantages in manufacturing, as demonstrated by their performance, such as graduating more STEM students every year than the rest of the world combined. I don't know what the ratio of STEM students is between China and the US. It's probably somewhere between 5 and 10 to 1. So there's no way where you have that talent disadvantage. The other thing is you have a cost disadvantage. If you look at auto workers, the average hourly wage for auto workers is probably over $30, maybe even $40 an hour. China's a fraction of that. So when you say, okay, I'm going to keep China out with tariffs, at the end of the day, you have to say, okay, now that you've done that, what do you need to rebuild manufacturing as a country core competence? You need labor. It doesn't exist in the US. You do not have highly trained people who are used to working hard, and getting paid at reasonable wages. They're highly paid and work relatively fewer hours, certainly compared to the Chinese, and they don't have the training. And then the second thing you need is you need capital. What institutions are going to put billions of dollars into rebuilding manufacturing in the U.S. when there's no logical way to think you're going to actually make that work competitively in global markets? So I think the core issue between the U.S. and China that is going to play out is China is going to continue to be the global manufacturer. I think today they've got like low 30% of all global manufacturing. Nobody else is even in double digits. And people are predicting that 5 to 10 years from now, that's going to be 40%. So Trump is destined to remain unhappy, and he's going to quickly discover that his ability to really influence China gets smaller every day. So if you go back not that many years ago, the U.S. accounted for 20% of all exports coming out of China. Now it's 13%. And that number keeps going down because the developing world, which China has cultivated very effectively, is taking a bigger and bigger share. So I think the fundamental of China-U.S. relations is going to be an unhappy Trump, because he is not going to achieve his objectives of rebuilding manufacturing in the U.S. He may improve the trade balance, but that's not a measure that anyone thinks is even relevant. So I think China is going to continue to do what it's always done, what's in their best interest. They'll continue to use industrial policies as a way to accelerate growth in advanced technology areas, as they've done with EVs and renewable energy and robotics and high-speed train. So I think Trump is going to get frustrated because he's going to be largely ignored by China because they don't have to respond. But he doesn't have. There's no plan B. In other words, his only tool is tariffs. And it's not going to get him what he wants. And he's going to get frustrated. And so the question is, what happens? I just think it's going to lead him, if anything, to get more erratic and more aggressive. But there's no path that's going to lead to the outcome that he's committed to.
You mentioned technology. So let's talk about the so-called technology competition between the United States and China, the clean energy, of course, EVs, and particularly, I think, high-tech arenas like AI.
Yes.
So China has, I think, the DeepSeek clearly demonstrated that China is catching up very rapidly in that field as well. So some people argue that China's rise in high-tech fields like AI will likely to lead to a so-called the bifurcation of technology standards between China and the United States. So do you agree with that? So what does this bifurcation mean for sort of global governance?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the underlying idea that the U.S. can contain China in technology is just a foolish idea. So if you simply start out with the quality of the education system in China is dramatically stronger than in the U.S. It's because in the U.S., the education system is largely run by local communities who have a range of different needs. Becoming great in technology is not one of them. So in China, where you've got students declaring at relatively young ages that they want to focus on the sciences, doesn't exist in the U.S. So you start out with a huge disadvantage in talent. The second is China, because it has very effective industrial policies that have been honed over many decades. So when the U.S. comes out with its CHIPS Act and says, okay, we're going to do the same thing ourselves, there's no way you get good at tapping into the country's talent pool at companies, at universities, in the government, and organize them to function as a coherent team, to make logical investments in them, and manage the process in a disciplined way. And that's how China went from being nowhere in auto to being the leader in EVs globally in a relatively short period of time. U.S. does not have any history of industrial policies. In fact, they're viewed as illegal and unfair. And so I think if you look at the fundamentals, it wasn't going to happen, but now it's becoming apparent. So when Huawei came out with their new phone, everyone in the U.S. was shocked. How did they get that chip? They're not allowed to. Chinese are smart, right? I mean, so to start out with the idea that you've got a product that's being sold and distributed globally, and you're going to prevent China from getting access to it is just totally naive. And then when DeepSeek came out, everybody said that's impossible. How could they, where did they get their chips? China's always got to find a way. So I think what's happening that will be constructive for both the US and China is increasingly rationality is going to apply, and the US is going to say, this was a fool's errand. We cannot contain China in technology, and therefore the only alternative is to say each country does where they're strongest, goes back to their strengths, and looks for opportunities to team up with the other side, not in areas like security, but there are plenty of other commercial applications where it can be genuine win-wins. So that's the path we're on. When that gets recognized in the marketplace, I don't know. I think everybody who understands AI would say the idea of having dual systems is ridiculous. It would be an enormous waste of money globally for everybody. And the reality is Trump is not going to be around after his term is up, and AI is going to become an increasingly important economic force long term. And the thoughtful people in the U.S. are going to find a way to have a common global system. It's the only logical right answer, and I think it's absolutely going to happen. It's probably not going to happen during Trump's reign because that's rational economic thinking, and that's not something he deals in.
Many American companies, such as like Tesla, Apple, are still deepening their supply chain dependence on China, while some other American industries are so-called friend-shoring. So do you think the global supply chain will also form two parallel systems in China and the United States?
Well, I think people underestimate the time and effort required to build sophisticated supply chains. So if you've had a supply chain that's been working very effectively for the last 20 years in China, and you say, okay, I'm going to take that to Thailand or Cambodia or Vietnam or Mexico, you just can't do that from a sophisticated technology point of view. So I think what we've seen in the meantime is China basically doing the vast majority of value added domestically, then shipping it to a third country for export. The U.S. has now figured that out and says we're going to find a way to make sure that that gets tariffed. But that starts with the underlying idea that tariffs are a longer term answer, and they're not. So I think that what's going to happen is the companies that are sophisticated, like Tesla and some of the other countries you mentioned who've been in China for a long time, they understand that you cannot match those supply chains anywhere else. And they're going to continue to deal with China because they found a way to deal with China that's a win-win. So those companies have done, like Apple, like P&G, have done very well in China financially. But I think what is going to happen is, because of the uncertainty with Trump and that the whole issue of foreign direct investment is really up in the air today. Because if you're a CEO, and let's say that you've got important relationships in Canada, and you go from one day, they're going to be the 51st state, and we're going to put on 25% tariffs, and the next day, you're my best friend. You can't, as a CEO, make billion-dollar investments with 10-year paybacks when you have that kind of swing in policy. So right now, we're in a situation where the big U.S. companies are just frozen. They're saying we can't afford to make bets, and we're certainly not going to bet in other countries' supply chains being able to come close to matching the quality and cost performance of the Chinese. So, I think the reality is that the Chinese export strategy will continue to face headwinds because globally protectionism is becoming the norm. And so China's going to have to reinvent itself on supply chains, because it's one thing to have a supply chain where you basically say, we'll build it and then you give us the money. A lot of, especially developing countries, are saying China is so much stronger in manufacturing than we are that our manufacturing people are saying we can't compete. So we're getting a lot of pushbacking internally, which means China needs to reinvent the model of supply chains so that its partners can capture more of the economic value. But I think that's doable. So the model will change, but we're going to be stuck for a while because of the uncertainty driven by Trump. And so the whole notion, even though obviously President Xi has been hosting global leaders for multiple meetings, you see relatively little evidence of FDI increasing materially as a result of those. And so we're just going to have to wait until the dust settles. And I think a lot of that's going to happen with the midterm elections. And people are going to realize that not only is Trump not coming back, but the people who embraced his philosophy are not going to come back.